we're here talking about the Red Cross achievements or work with children in detention. Now, around the world, there's perhaps 100 countries that detain children for immigration purposes. But as we heard Professor Triggs this morning tell us, most of them it's a couple of days to a couple of weeks, whereas Australia's average at the moment is about 15 months, which means if you take the average somewhere around the middle, there's a lot of children and unaccompanied minors staying in detention quite a long while, and we'll hear more about that. If you look up the internet, you find the Australian Government Immigration Department, which goes by a different name every year, says it is government policy that children will not be held in immigration detention centres. It then goes on, though, and says children might be accommodated, and then lists a whole range of things, including alternative places of detention, immigration residential housing, immigration transit accommodation. So we are talking about all of those things, but it's important to remember that our work in Red Cross is underpinned particularly by the first 4 of our 7 fundamental principles: our humanity for the people in detention, our impartiality, our neutrality, and our independence. Today we have 3 very good speakers here to talk to us. You've all read their CVs, I'm sure, in the pack that you were given when you registered, so I won't go back through those. But we all remember that from this morning's talk that Professor Triggs started her talk and finished her talk with "it's all about respect and dignity." So with that, I'll ask our first speaker, Noel Clement, who I won't tell you anything embarrassing about. He asked me not to.
Thank you, John. I didn't think you would actually not say anything embarrassing, so thank you. Good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be here and talk to you about the work that we're doing, and I know I'm talking to a lot of people who will know a lot of things that I'm going to talk about, so I do want to just acknowledge the work that we've done, particularly over the last 4 years, but back to 20 years. But then more importantly, I think I want to come back to what's still to be done. And a bit along the lines that Melanie Oppenheimer was just talking about, you know, in some senses you feel like you've achieved a lot and, you know, one crisis is over, it can be hard to rally for the next, but there are very important crises in front of us that we do need to rally around as a humanitarian organisation and movement. But I just thought I'd cover some quick background for people who may not know the history of this. And I'll go back to 1992, which is when mandatory detention was introduced in Australia, and it also happens to be when we first started visiting immigration detention and first started delivering the asylum seeker assistance scheme in the community. So we have a long history of working around these issues on a range of fronts. I fast forward to about 2003 when there was a thing called the Welfare Offer. And the Welfare Offer was a whole group of organisations in the community who got together and presented to Minister Ruddock at the time a proposal to move asylum seekers into the community to care for them in the community. This was 2 years after Tampa, and it was at a time when mandatory detention was, at that time we thought, at its peak, and large numbers of children were being held in detention, and there was absolutely no mechanism to get anybody out of detention unless they had a visa. There was no community detention, there were no bridging visas for people who arrived by boat. The Welfare Offer didn't succeed at the time, but I think it planted the seed, certainly with people in the Immigration Department, and I hope people within government, that there were alternatives they could look at. I moved forward then to 2005, which was a number of things coming together, and Gillian Triggs talked this morning about the inquiry, which was a few years earlier. But there were also movements within the government at the time that were expressing concern about children, particularly being in detention. And I mentioned this for some people who were at the launch of our Reflections report last night, that Red Cross, for its part, following the Welfare Offer, which we were closely involved in, had actually worked with Melisons, who were acknowledged last night as a key partner of ours, to produce some legal advice around the issues with the legislation as it was at that time, and why people couldn't be moved into the community. 2005 took a change within government and some pressure within the government ranks for the Prime Minister at the time to make a decision to remove children from detention, and we had 90 family members and children moved into community detention, known as residence determinations. And it was really the very first time since mandatory detention that there was a legally structured process for getting vulnerable people out of detention into the community. I fast forward another few years, and over the next 5 years or so, a lot of pressure from a lot of the sector, and certainly we were playing our part to try and expand the use of community detention, to broaden it to other vulnerable people who are in detention with various levels of success. But most of the time through that, we had small numbers. We were talking 50 to 100 people in community detention. It really took until, I think, about 2009, 2010 for the winds to start to shift again, and government of the day coming in with what it described as its detention values. And in fact, John, the no detention of children that you mentioned was one of the detention values of the government at the time. And a lot of work within the Ministers' Council that I sit on and that Maryanne also sits on, and particularly a subgroup that Maryanne may talk about, that was really looking at how we use community detention to support what was then a growing number of children in detention, because the community detention powers, while it was still in place, was a minister's discretion. And the minister needed to make a decision on each individual case whether or not he or she would exercise that discretion. So the Ministers' Council actually came to Red Cross at that time and asked us whether we would lead an expansion of community detention if the minister at the time agreed to this, which is what happened. So from 2010, we then saw a massive expansion in the move of families and children into community detention. And that then moved in 2011 to introduction of bridging visa releases. So the most important thing of all of that, I think, is an enormous shift in both the sort of legislative frameworks, but also decisions of government to process people in the community and not leave vulnerable people, particularly in held detention environments, for a long time. Why Red Cross? Look, at that time, and certainly right back to the welfare offer, there was a recognition, I think, from a lot of people in the sector that our neutrality, our independence, our focus on humanity, as well as our long experience in this area, perfectly positioned Red Cross to be able to play a role in this. We weren't an organisation that was going to, use the removal of families and children from detention into the community for, party political purposes or to criticise or attack government. Governments and the sector knew that we would just be getting on with it and responding from a humanitarian perspective. So there was trust, and certainly there were quite a number of agencies in the sector who pushed us forward and promoted us. The Ministers' Council, as I said, identified that Red Cross was an appropriate organisation to help when the expansion came. That's changed over the last few years when we've had, I guess it's become more commonplace that yes, families moved into the community, children are cared for in the community, and a range of other organisations have also entered the space, 20 of them initially working with us as partners, but then a number of them being directly sourced by government. And we've really welcomed that because it's been great to make this commonplace, to make this just a part of the fabric of what we do. But as I'll talk about, and I think our other speakers will talk about, that's all starting to wind back again and shift again. So I don't think we can ever take these things for granted and think that we've achieved it and so we can move forward. Why are we focused on this, and have we been? It is really about the impact of prolonged detention, particularly on children and young people, but it's all people. Our experience of 20 years of visiting detention centres tells us that longer than about 3 months in detention and the most resilient people are starting to be broken down. Mental health is impacted. For children, there are significant developmental delay issues, and Georgie may talk to some of this later. Families aren't able to function as a family. You're living in environments where you're very close to other families, you're sharing facilities. Families can't cook for their kids, families can't provide for their kids. They can't really have structure and the sort of, family boundaries that they may have had prior to being in detention. And children and young people, but all people in detention, are witnessing issues of self-harm, witnessing other people's deterioration. So the significant trauma that comes from that environment. All of those are reasons why we believed it was critical as a humanitarian issue for us to focus on getting people out of detention and into the community. And I need to be clear, none of this from a Red Cross point of view says that people should be allowed to stay in Australia, they need to leave. We've never taken a position on all asylum seekers from a visa processing point of view, except to say that they should have a fair process, they should have the right to make their claims, they should have proper advice, including legal advice, and they need appropriate humanitarian support while they're going through that. And our argument all along has been that if people are cared for appropriately in the community, they're more effectively able to participate in the resolution of their status than if their health is damaged and they become entrenched in a locked-in fighting position. What has been achieved? More than 25,000 people moved into the community who would have otherwise been held in locked detention environments. For Red Cross and its partners, the peak numbers we reached were about 12,000 of those supported. At the moment, we're still supporting about 11,000, and that includes about 1,600 people in community detention. But I just want to finish talking about what's still to be done, because there's an enormous challenge ahead of us, and I know Georgie is particularly going to talk about what's happening at the moment. We might be able to move people out of detention. As we know, and Gillian Triggs has talked this morning, there are well over 700 children in detention still who are being damaged by the detention environment every day. But moving families and children, other people out of detention, isn't a panacea in itself. It does address the significant challenges of the environment. It does mean that families can function as a family. It does mean that other parts of the community can rally around and provide support. But I really want to underscore the issue of the impact of uncertainty. Prolonged uncertainty for people has massive detrimental impacts on people's health and well-being. So we might be able to assist with moving people out of a detention environment, but if their visa is not being resolved, if they don't feel like they've got any hope for future, that is very undermining in people's health and well-being. And that's the experience that we're having at the moment. We have people who've been in the community for 2 to 3 years who've not yet been able to put their claim for protection forward. For those who maybe have made a claim, those claims have not been processed. People are getting very strong messages, out in the public domain about the fact that there's not a long-term future for them in Australia. That even if there is a future for them, and as you know, government is talking at the moment about temporary protection visas, that in itself will give people some sense of hope that maybe there is something I can hold on to. But beyond that will then come the concern about what then? What beyond the sort of 3 years of a temporary protection visa? I won't be able to reunite with families. So we have large numbers of unaccompanied minors who've come here, large numbers of young men in their early 20s, all as the hopes of their family of trying to make some safety and find some safety for themselves, but also be able to reunite with family at some stage. There are significant gaps, and there is a report we put out a year or two ago, the vulnerability report, where we were talking about the gaps in community care. Those gaps are not improving at the moment, but it is issues around ongoing education and meaningful engagement for people who are waiting for resolution of their status. People are living on very meagre incomes. There are issues of homelessness. There are issues about being able to connect to community. All of this is having an impact on children now in the community. Children are seeing their parents suffering. They're seeing their parents losing hope, and they're seeing their parents in some instances self-harm. So there are significant detrimental impacts, even for the so-called lucky ones who are in the community who may be eligible for some form of a visa, even if it's a temporary visa. I just want to finish quickly on Red Cross, and you may be aware, if you do pass our Carlton offices, we've just put banners up in our Carlton offices, and if people are on Facebook, please get on and like them. We've posted a photo of it on Facebook, and all it says is asylum seekers, people like you and me seeking a safe future. Now, we've posted that on Facebook and had, I've just looked this morning, over 3,500 likes. About 700 people have shared it. It's fantastic. I've read through all of the comments, and I just summarise the comments as very positive, very proud, people who really welcome it. The negative side is people who are saying that Red Cross is walking a thin line. We've stepped over the line, we're being political, that people who are coming are not genuine, and that we should worry about people who are at home. And I want to underscore this because one of the big challenges for us going forward is about how do we change policy and how do we change community attitudes. Because community attitudes are entrenched to a point where a banner that is a positive sign that is purely saying that asylum seekers are people and that they're seeking a safe future, that makes no comment on government policy, makes no comment on whether people should be allowed to stay or go, is something that a number of people are seeing as political, and Red Cross somehow or other stepping out of its neutral line. There's been quite an argument, if you look on Facebook, about neutrality as a result of that. I'm really proud that we're doing it, but I think it's a very small start of something that needs to be much bigger and needs to start with changing hearts and minds and introducing a humanitarian perspective. And none of that has to be about commenting on any particular government or any particular policy. Just the fact that these are people who are being damaged at the moment and that we as a humanitarian organisation see it as a humanitarian issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Noel. Noel, you reminded me of part of the history of this visiting detention centres. You mentioned 1992. I recall I was chairman of the Northern Territory Division at the time, and people arrived in the north of Australia and were brought into Darwin and placed in a camp of tents. And we in the Northern Territory Division thought, hey, something's on here, so we bluffed our way into that detention centre by saying Red Cross always does this sort of thing, and it's flowed from there. Noel, you very clearly laid out the history of Red Cross involvement, particularly in the last 10 years, and the changes to policy that have occurred during that time. You also, importantly, outlined the Red Cross's stance in this field and our reasons for it. And to be followed by the next two speakers, you introduced the impact of uncertainty, which is very much what we're about at the moment. So, as our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Maryanne Loughry, but before I do, she told me a little earlier that she first came into working for Red Cross in 1994, where she went away as a delegate for Australian Red Cross to Palestine. So, Maryanne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and very much congratulations for the 100 years. And I played a small role 20 years ago in going into the occupied territories. Interestingly, I went because they were releasing men from detention in Gaza. Think Oslo, think Arafat, and we were looking at a future where people wouldn't be in detention in Palestine. And it's a bit like the story of what I'm going to tell you now. It's 2 steps forward and more than 1 backwards. But again, one of the things I want to do in Noel's set up very much the policy. I'm wanting to put some stories and a bit of flesh around the stories as to what has been the issue of the UAMs, in particular the children unaccompanied minors, and the role that the Red Cross has played and the challenges that we've encountered with the Red Cross in playing that role. I want to start though by acknowledging a few people in the last while. Liz DeVries, Sonia, also Annie Harvey and Anne Knowles, Noel himself. There have been some very key people through the Red Cross that have played a very significant role in helping us to get children out of detention in the last while. And 3 of them are here in this room at least. So I really want to acknowledge that. As Noel said, the discussion around getting children out of detention was not an unfamiliar role. It was something that had been talked about. It didn't happen immediate with the conversation. The political time had to be right. The time I recall that the political time was right was when we actually started a conversation, I'll say some names, with Senator Evans when he was the minister. He said, keep talking about it, but don't make it public. But I'm interested in models where we could get children out of detention. Now, this was just on 4 years ago, probably 4.5 years ago, when we had, similar to now, hundreds of children, in particular unaccompanied children, in detention. Now, even when I was preparing this, I was thinking, we've been there before, 4 years ago only, and we're there again now. That's where I'm going 2 steps forward, X number back. But Senator Evans said, yes, tell us what could be possible. Now, one of the things that made it possible, I think, Noel, is the fact that Red Cross had a community detention program 4 years ago. It was small. It was for people who had terminal diseases, who shouldn't be in detention, or families that had extraordinary problems. But it existed, and it provided a framework, a language, an understanding of what was possible. What we put to Senator Evans and then later to Minister Bowen, who actually enabled the expansion, was we could work with the Red Cross, we civil society. It was a lot of religious groups in particular, but it was also out of care providers. So it was agencies like Wesley, agencies like MacKillop Services, who did not know this space, but knew how to look after people in the community. We said to the government at the time, put those people with the knowledge and the framework and the backbone that the Red Cross has provided in a smaller program, put that together, and we think we have sufficient to get children out of detention. And the rest is history, 4 years ago, let there be a huge expansion, and children, families with children, unaccompanied minors, did get out of detention. So I think even though initially it wasn't the right time, then it was a small example. I think it's an example, thinking of what Professor Oppenmeyer's just told us, where over time what we've put in place can still be operationalised, and I think it was in my recollection of what occurred. We had lots of problems, there's no kidding, and literally I'm telling you that expansion happened on the 23rd of December, the first group out. So there's your first problem. Which agency is sitting around on the 23rd of December waiting to receive, at that stage, girls who were going to come out of detention? So the problems were enormous, as Noel's already indicated. The children, getting them out is only the beginning. There's been enormous effects in detention, previous to detention, the flight experience, where they've come from, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, all these places have already impacted these children. So by the time we get them out of detention, into the community, there's possibly already issues. But we also know there's strengths. If they've got here, they have an amazing capacity. So we've also worked in a model of working with them in a partnership, especially with the older kids. We've engaged with them. So, and that's where we were much helped, because the Red Cross rightly said, not our expertise really, children in the community in care, not really where we want to work. We know more the immigration part, the framework, interfacing with the government, etc. So the providers, as they became, or the partners with Red Cross, started to bring their expertise, rules, how do you engage with kids, how do you get them doing meaningful activities when they're in the community. Now, when I'm talking about kids too, I'm talking about issues like, as I say, a lot of them have lived an adult life in coming here. If I'm talking about the unaccompanied kids, I'm also talking about what really is their age. We heard some reference to wrist x-rays, and I was a couple of years ago in Kabul, and I was going past a school and the kids were coming out of school. I said to the car driver, "Stop the car." I wanted to see what kids coming out of school, what sort of beard they had. Let me have a look at what they look like as school kids in Kabul. So, some of them clearly had different ages to what they'd said, different backgrounds to what they'd initially told to the authorities, etc. But what we managed to have was a partnership with other agencies to negotiate those issues. I have to tell you it wasn't easy. When we started, the Department of Immigration were very, very open to our advice. But over time, the Department of Immigration started advising us. So that made for a relationship that, and also, I mean, it's no secret, and Liz and Sonia and Noel can tell you, you had multiple partners. And those partners, in terms of providers, other agencies, were in it for humanitarian reasons, but with different perspectives and different capacities. So it was a huge risk for the Red Cross, and it was a huge challenge to bring that many people along to this challenge. But I must say, and I can say this in all honesty, because I participate in a number of the interagency meetings, on the whole, there's been enormous sharing of experience. People have not been very much holding, this is my contract, I'm not going to tell you what we're doing. In terms of best practice, there's been some very, very strong, good sharing of best practice. But it's come at a cost because, as Noel said, now some of those agencies themselves have been given contracts because they've learnt through partnering with the Red Cross many things, including how to work with the government. And that alone is a huge challenge. And so now, as you would have read in the media, in recent times, the contract for the Red Cross has gone down and other agencies have stepped up. Now, that's good and bad news. It's good news that we have a lot more people interested in this work, but it's an enormous challenge for people who are employed by the Red Cross who are now handing over clients, etc. And I certainly acknowledge that that's a problem. As I said, the issues that we've had and the issues that we're going to continue to have, the kids, the children now, we've got them again in detention. We're waiting to see what this bill is going to do, the current bills that are going through Parliament in terms of releasing the children to detention. While we've been experienced with dealing with children who've been in detention from the experience I've talked of before, in recent times, like 18 months ago, they were in detention for a couple of months max. We're now up to, again, having children who've been in detention, as you've heard, for even up to 2 years, 3 years. If they come into community detention with Red Cross or other providers, or they come into the community on a bridging visa, getting assistance through Red Cross and other providers to manage with their families in the community, they are going to possibly have even more issues than the ones that we faced earlier, because they've been in detention longer, and now we've got temporary protection visas, which, as you know, brings a great deal more uncertainty. They also haven't been processed, so there's been a huge amount of anxiety. I know there's issues around domestic violence. I've worked in refugee camps. The wife will say at some stage, I'm over this, I want to go back. The husband will say, we're not going back. Build that up over time. You can really have, where you just see at different times people give up on the experience and want to return or want to do something different. So we're going to have, I think, families and children with greater issues than we've possibly seen in the past. We're dealing with a policy area where both governments are holding to this policy area. I think a big challenge that I want to throw out to Red Cross, and we've attempted to work in this space before, is the announcement of Indonesia this week, that Australia will no longer take people from Indonesia after a certain cut-off date. I know that there are now hundreds of unaccompanied minors in detention in Indonesia, now with no prospect of a resettlement pathway to Australia with family here. I also know that through the Red Cross networks, we have people working in Indonesia. My own agency works in Indonesia. As we think of, as an Australian nation, a regional framework or regional thinking, I think we have to also move from just thinking about community detention or bridging visas in Australia to where are we regionally? How do we collaborate? As we do internationally, how do we also collaborate regionally? I think also Without wanting to say too much, we also have the challenge of Nauru and Manus. More particular in dealing with children, we have the challenge of Nauru. I've been a number of times to Nauru. The Nauruan government needs assistance to fulfil what they've been asked to do. How do we partner with another government? And this will be, if this model continues, how do we partner with other governments to increase their capacity? Whether we're comfortable or not with the policy, the issue of how do they actually become aware of what they're signed on to, and how do they learn what we've learnt from best practice in order to be able to put into better practice what's happening in these countries. So that's the start of some of the stories that I've seen, but again, to firmly acknowledge that the Red Cross have played a major role and a very formative role in what's happening with how we've addressed children and unaccompanied minors in our Australian community. Thank you.
Thank you, Maryanne. You've pointed out to us the importance of partnership and engagement in dealing with the issues that there are. Red Cross has been looking through this whole process to partner other agencies, and you also talked about the challenges of working with the government. I think those challenges perhaps remain quite strongly, and the future challenges of working with the children and the difficulties that there will be as they come out of detention. Our next speaker, Dr. Georgia Paxton, isn't on the Ministers' Advisory Council, but she has been contributing here quite significantly in Victoria. So, welcome, George.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a privilege and a pleasure. I confess it's not been the easiest area to speak to, and today I want to raise some ideas, some issues, propose a model of how we consider the impact of migration, and I'm here to provide a clinical perspective on working with children and young people who are seeking asylum. I'm a paediatrician. I work with kids really across the board. I see large numbers of Victorian-born children, I see children on bridging visas, I see children in community detention, and increasingly, recently, I work with the children who are in held detention in Victoria. I will present the numbers from the Immigration, Detention and Community Statistics Summary. But basically, at the moment, we have just over 3,000 people in held detention on Christmas Island and the mainland, including 559 children. We have around the same number in community detention, and more than half of this total are children and young people. We have just over 25,000 people on bridging visas, and we have over 2,100 people in places of offshore processing, including 167 children in Nauru. Victoria is a hotspot for community detention, as I'm sure many of you will know. We have the largest numbers of people in community detention of any of the jurisdictions, with 40% of the total. And we have 1,221 people and more than 600 children in community detention. The average duration of detention is 426 days, or around 14 months. And there are many children who have been in detention for longer than this. And parents measure the duration in detention in terms of the proportion of their child's lifetime. I have parents of 4-year-olds saying to me, my child has spent more than a quarter of their life in detention. I cannot ever get over that. And it's worthwhile considering the period of detention in terms of the age of the child. I wanted to speak briefly about migration and trauma. And in working with people who arrive under the offshore program, firstly with kids and families, trauma was actually often in the background. And the trauma was around the forced migration journey and the conditions in the country of origin, which were often ongoing situations of conflict. And information about this would emerge over time as you got to know the families and develop trust and some degree of rapport. With people seeking asylum, trauma is first and foremost in the consultation. It's often the first thing that comes up as they walk in the room. And it's not only about the background story and the migration journey, it's about their experience on the boat, and it's about their experience in detention. And the children we see who are seeking asylum in Australia have all come through the detention centres, through Christmas Island, sometimes through many of the different detention centres. We have one young man who's been through 8 detention centres. And when I see them, generally they're from Maita, which is about half an hour's drive from here. And the broader Victorian community is often unaware of the fact we have an immigration detention centre 15 minutes from our CBD. These are the main offices. These are the accommodation units at MITRE. They're hard-walled structures. If you look at this photo, this is all publicly available. You can see the buggies stacked between the accommodation units. These are quite small units, and each room has a set of double bunks. They were actually intended and developed for single men. But these are families living there. So families either choose to sleep in one room altogether or have maybe one adult and child in one room and one adult and child in another. The net effect is actually everyone ends up sleeping in the same room with people on the floor. Conditions are crowded and children are sleeping in a situation that is very close and very close to other families. So what do we know of the impact of detention? I think this is actually a really interesting question. I wanted to flag the issue of research and monitoring. We run a research clearinghouse on our hospital website. Someone gave me publication rights many years ago. And every year we update it. And it's a systematic search of all the Australian published literature on refugee and asylum seekers. And we split it into topics. There are 40-odd articles on asylum seekers and or Australian immigration detention. But when you actually look through this tally, the majority are opinion pieces or literature reviews, and there are a few prospective and long-term studies. And the prospective long-term studies we have are generally from a few years ago, and they're about adults. We have no long-term data on children. We have no post-release and long-term developmental data on the impact of this situation. If you know where to look, and this is available on the department website, there are some pieces of information about the health screening of people in detention. This is the health data set from July to September 2013. It's prior to the recent election and the policy changes. But if you text search this report for children, you'll find there's only two references. One is the age demographic breakdown and the other is in reference to vaccination. And whilst this report is largely focused around mental health screening in adults, there is no information on mental health screening or conditions for children. In the public meter, it's been announced that we were implementing screening for mental health in children using the Health of Nations outcome scores, but there's not been any information or data arising from this screening program. And this is where publicly available information actually becomes one of the sources of information about conditions for children in detention. The previous Human Rights Commission inquiry, the current Human Rights Commission inquiry. These are some of the only stories and large amounts of assessment that we have for children in immigration detention. I would add that I think the internal monitoring role is a parallel and equally important role. However, there is a real lack of information on what happens. In my own practice, I'm seeing people as patients they've been referred for a reason, usually a medical reason, and I have a duty of care to them as an individual in front of me, and it's one of the things that underpins my work as a doctor. There's a lot written about working with vulnerable communities and the ethics of researching these communities. There's work on the dual loyalty of doctors working within immigration detention. And there's an argument that my duty of care extends beyond the individual into the public space. However, if I tried to put through a research project through my hospital research ethics committee, they would very rightly find that very difficult to assess and consider given the extreme vulnerability of that group. That's at my clinic level. But at an individual level, the people I'm seeing now in held detention actually, in my professional opinion, are not fit to give informed consent. And that's because of the severity of the parents' mental health problems. And that's not an easy thing to say, but that is the reality for our work. So I'm being bold enough to present a model. In the past, our work with people of refugee background and the impact of trauma, we've largely focused on the refugee experience, the trauma in people's countries and places of origin and transit, their forced migration journeys, and the impact with mental health consequences. And to some degree, our mental health services and our torture trauma services have been predicated around this. The thing is once you arrive in Australia, the refugee experience has an end point. You've entered a new phase of settlement. And mental health consequences often have a start and also an end point. And this is the way that medical and health providers are familiar with working. What I would suggest, though, is that we actually need to consider the asylum experience in and of itself and the interplay between that experience, the background journey, and the mental health consequences. And I bring this to the discussion and the panel discussion that I think some of the key areas here are the uncertainty, the depersonalisation, the dependency, the issues with family functioning and parenting, the irritability and tension which often evolves to frank conflict, and the vicarious or secondary trauma. And I think these themes run through held detention, community detention, and people on bridging visas. I think there is a gradation of severity, and arguably offshore is more severe than onshore held detention, which is more severe than community or bridging visas. The uncertainty is profound, it's overriding, it's overarching, and it becomes all-consuming. This is a quote from an unaccompanied minor in the Human Rights Commission inquiry. I accompanied them on the site visit to MITA, who simply described his detention experience as a present. There is no past and there is no future. And that encapsulates the reality for the people I see. And to some degree, they don't want to talk about their refugee experience because they want to talk about what is happening for them now, which is their asylum experience, to the extent where I suspect that often gets in the way of their ability to state their case and their story and their claim for the few people who do actually have the opportunity to talk with someone about that. The depersonalisation is also profound, and it's across all levels. It's from the very small things to the systematic policy settings. From an unaccompanied minor, name is not important, they only ask your number. If you want to update your contact details, you need to phone in with your name, address and your boat number. We get requests for specialist referral and they all have a boat number used as a form of identification. Some of them actually don't have a name. This is a small thing, but this is a child's immunisation record, and I've blanked out the number, but that was the only form of identification on that, and that's what the family handed me, and there is more than one female in the family. So it's up to the family to know whose card belongs to who based on their number. I actually found this deeply confronting, even though it's a seemingly small point. I can't file that in my medical record because there's not enough identifying details. I have to write the name, the date of birth, and my hospital number. And then there are policy settings. These are the directions for the language that we will use in relation to people arriving by boat. So people in detention are referred to as detainees. People in community detention are referred to as community detainees. People in the offshore settings are transferees, and people who arrive by boat on bridging visas are called IMAs on bridging visas. The terms are cumbersome, but what they serve to do is to separate the person from the policy settings, and they remove some of the immediacy of the impact of these decisions. The impact on families is profound. They're dependent on the Immigration Department for everything, for their shelter, for their welfare support, for the connections to their case support, for their school placement. And the work rights and lack of meaningful connection continue to influence families over time. Parenting is extremely difficult in this environment. Parents can't provide for their children and their mental health deteriorates over time. And family tension is actually very significant, erupting into frank conflict and relationship breakdown. And if it's not your family, you almost certainly hear it for the family next door. And throughout this, there is enormous guilt on the part of parents, and there's not been a great deal written about that. These are quotes from families. For any other child, their parents take them to school, their mother, their father, or both. Put yourself in my shoes. It makes me feel very small. And whilst education access has been a phenomenally positive thing for children, some of these things have profound impact on parents and families. And about room searches and the fact that a child would question his father as to why was this happening? Had they done something wrong? And this father felt that he could not explain to his child that he hadn't done something wrong because their room was repeatedly searching. And this is ongoing. And when you cannot provide for your children, it just shatters you. These are very simple quotes, but this is what's happening for the families at the moment. And this is what has happened and continues to happen for the families that are based in the community. Developmental impact on children. Well, again, we don't have good measures, we don't have good prospective data, but I would ask you to consider the developmental domains. This is what I assess as a paediatrician when I check in on a child's development. I look at their language, their cognition, their social skills and their play, their gross and fine motor development and their adaptive function, toilet training, behaviour regulation. We see children with language regression. We see children with mutism related to trauma. Children stop and halt in their play. They become inattentive, they can't focus, they can't concentrate. They're irritable and they fight with all of the other children who are in a similar place. In terms of adaptive functioning, when we wrote the Foundation House handbook for GPs and primary care providers on refugee health, there was a whole lot of stuff from the earlier edition on secondary bedwetting. And I went to Dr. Ida Kaplan at Foundation House and I said, look, Ida, I've just never seen this. I was working with offshore arrivals at this point in 2007. I've never seen it. I've seen large numbers of kids with primary bedwetting, and I manage them like I would Australian-born kids. To which she replied, I remember the children in Woomera. And that was actually all she said. Every older child I see has secondary wetting. I had never seen it before the last 12 months, and every child I see has that. And some children actually have secondary faecal soiling. But often that might just be the detention centre and not at school. Kids have a very strong sense of justice and fairness. You know that by watching them play and watching them interact with each other and turn-taking and who gets the most or the fair slice of cake. And this is an important part of their own understanding of immigration detention. Adolescence is also a period of development. It's a time of transitions, physical, cognitive, social, recreational, vocational. You explore your identity, you develop a self-identity, you explore sexuality and relationships. This is all imposed on migration and cultural transitions, language transitions, and adolescents often have a degree of role reversal and act as brokers for their families, which may increase as parents become impaired. They also have disruption to their daily routine, and it's a time when they often make meaning of past trauma. Again, they have a very strongly developed sense of justice and fairness. And I draw your attention to our child and adolescent outcomes framework. This is our Victorian framework. I'm sure the other jurisdictions have similar frameworks for how we measure child wellbeing, but our government here in Victoria says that in order to have a safe, healthy child who's learning, developing and achieving wellbeing, we need to have confident and capable families, strong and supportive communities and an enabling society. And there are a variety of outcomes we actually look at, which we think are the key things to achieve this. So it's optimal physical health, optimal social and emotional development, optimal language and cognitive development, safe communities, families that are functioning and able with strong parent-child structures, and a society that's providing quality care across the child lifespan. And I think when you reflect on these outcomes and you reflect on the experience of children who have come from or have been in or are in detention, we have some very, very serious issues. Child protection issues I will touch on because there must be a significant risk. This is a locked environment. It's an environment of conflict, irritability and tension. Parents have mental health problems. Children and adolescents are exposed to others with mental health problems. It's an environment which one would expect there is a higher risk of sexual abuse. We have large numbers of children and adults together, remembering that we separate children and adults in hospitals and in prisons. We don't have measurement of this. And there's anecdote and threads, but this is very difficult to quantify. It's worth knowing there's a complex framework in terms of, there's no definite framework and there are complex jurisdictional issues here. Immigration detention sits on Commonwealth land. Child protection services are state services. They don't actually have jurisdiction, and that also applies to community detention, interestingly enough. As providers, we have a duty of care for children at risk. When do we say the secondary risk from environmental and violence exposure triggers our child protection reporting responses? Our law has recently changed in Victoria, so it is now a criminal offence to not report child sexual abuse, which is an issue for all of the people providing case and welfare support, and that applies to all adults. Age assessment I will touch on briefly, simply to say that we regard this as a complex process. It takes a long time, often several visits, and we would argue that we have a duty to review the narrative history, documentation. We do physical examination, we're doctors, pubertal status, dental eruption, reviewing growth. One of the simplest things we could do to facilitate age assessment for kids in detention would be to measure their height serially while they're in there so we can tell if they're still growing. A very straightforward step. We check their development, maturity, education, learning, and how they get along with their peers and teachers. The department process is actually similar and based on the British Home Office process. For all of you, as a brief red flag message, people in detention, children in detention don't necessarily have a health check. Please ask, and kids should have had 3 sets of needles, screening blood tests, ideally a poo test. Well, I'm probably not going to get that through. Screening for TB exposure, but they need to understand what tests have been performed, understand the results, and check whether the issues have been managed. So considerations in moving forward. Really, I think we need to address or consider the asylum experience in and of itself. And this requires significant changes to the policy setting. We need to have more prompt refugee status determination, and any move from a held environment to a less restrictive environment is positive, albeit with its own challenges. I would view that work rights and education access are essential to maintain individual and family integrity. And I think we still have opportunity to address health and mental health together, but I think our mental health services particularly need to understand the asylum experience and consider that as well as the other issues. Empowering people is the only thing we can attempt to do, but it is becoming increasingly difficult. I always use the concept of dual permission. You can tell me anything, but you don't have to tell me everything. And looking back, understanding that adolescence will make meaning. And I think given the complexity of this space, there is actually a strong argument for specialised services. Meaningful engagement is essential, and any community hubs, volunteering, engaging with local schools is of benefit, and meticulous communication is essential. And that, I think, is an area we can all work towards, and it involves linking our agencies and collaborating. I will finish with your own logo, which I so know I'm not supposed to use, particularly in the presence of a Red Cross room. But the power of humanity and finding the people within these stories, recognising their stories, but also finding the people within the policy settings. There are good people within and across all levels of the government department. And if we provide the human face, and if we collaborate, and if we communicate, I do think we have a chance of recognising the humanity in this situation. I would argue we should treat people as well as or ahead of the process. I'm not known for following process, but I think we don't need to refer back to the detention health services provider to make the referral to the next person. Ring the paediatricians directly, and we can mobilise the entire paediatric workforce of Victoria to help you. So thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. You gave us the numbers at the beginning to clarify things. Then you talked about trauma, the trauma of the journey, but more importantly, you talked about the trauma that comes after the journey is different. At the beginning, I talked about the Australian government policy of no children in detention centres, but we may accommodate them in other places. And you showed us the Maryanne Immigration Transit Accommodation, the MITA, where we can keep children in detention. And Georgie gave you a picture of that, the cramped space, the accommodation. So it's not much different to other places. You talked about the impact of detention and the lack of information about it. And without going through any of that, you frightened me when you said that many of your patients are not fit to give informed consent, and I think that about summarises it. We've got time for questions. Caitlin has a microphone, so because this goes on record, she'll come to you with the microphone if you have a question, and I'll stand over here at perhaps and give Noel this microphone. So, does anybody have a question? Yes. If you can identify yourselves when you ask your question, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
I'm Pat Pearson. My question is to Georgia particularly. You ended on saying that you could mobilise the paediatric in the sector. My question is about, with the letter you received saying that you can no longer refer to people as clients or patients. I mean, when a person enters a hospital system or any health system, they are technically a patient or a client, then supported by patient rights. And I'm just wondering if there's a space there for using that sort of argument about building a case about how we need to respond more appropriately, to children. Because the moment you say somebody isn't a patient or a client, then technically they're not protected by those sorts of rights. I know they are, because that's how you're practiced. I'm just wondering if there's a case for using that as mobilisation. That's what I'm wondering.
That letter is actually on the Freedom of Information logs within the department. It's the letter from the Minister to the department for the policy settings after the election. It's not a letter to a health service. Kids are kids first and foremost. They're patients when they're in our hospital. I think the language is problematic, and I simply refer to people as people and use those controversial terms of children, men and women. I don't think there should be any argument about that. My reference to the separating and division is there is still a gap between the department and the health service provider and there is still considerable administrative inefficiency within the referral processes and pathways. We would ask any caseworker to pick up the phone or email us as one of the central points of contact in Victoria for paediatric health services and simply ask us. And we will collaborate with permission of the person and family with all of the other health services providers. So if I want to refer to one of the mental health service providers, I absolutely will. I will treat them as I would any other child.
Thank you, Georgie. Yes.
Thank you. Jeff Skillen, Australian Red Cross. Could I ask a question of Noel? Noel, this morning we heard Gillian Triggs speak very eloquently about the effect on asylum seekers in Australia of the lack of the absence of a Bill of Rights within our constitutional and legal arrangements. And I was just wondering whether you might be prepared to make an observation, at least within the confines of this audience, about the prospects for Australian Red Cross ever publicly advocating for the institution of a Bill of Rights in Australia, noting that, to me at least, the institution of a Bill of Rights does not necessarily indicate a political or a particular outcome, such as the release of children from immigration detention, but at least would allow the judiciary in Australia, one of the three primary institutions provided for in our constitution, to judge things like the legality of immigration detention against human rights standards, which is something that, as Gillian reminded us this morning, is presently totally absent within our system, and using the Alcatab case as a graphic illustration. And finally, you may well say that the National Society would take a strategic decision that now might not be the best time to make that advocacy public, but perhaps at some stage in the future the time might be more opportune. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And Jeff is on our International Humanitarian Law Committee, and your committee, Jeff, would probably be the first place I'd come for advice on how we would do that. But look, I think there's great potential for the organisation to advocate in that space. I would question the timing at the moment, as you suggested. I mean, as you know, we don't even have a Red Cross Act, so even in terms of our own work, we have a Royal Charter. We've discussed the limitations of there not even being domestic legislation around having a national society. There's not domestic legislation around things like the Refugee Convention, etc. So I think there's great scope. I wonder if it's part of the dialogue we have publicly. What we have discussed doing is about changing the hearts and minds, both of community, but also working with backbenchers, working with all parties to start to influence their thinking. Perhaps a Bill of Rights is part of what we could take up as part of that, as something that's not about a specific issue such as asylum seekers, but would assist in a whole raft of things that we'd want to tackle as a national society. So I'd say, yes, consider it put on the list.
Well answered, Noel.
David Harper. I'm chair of the Victorian IHL committee and a lawyer, and I ought to know more about this question than, or at least the answer to the question, than I do. But Georgia mentioned that the Victorian legislation requires reporting of child abuse. It seems to me that the treatment in many, if not most instances, by the Commonwealth Government of children in detention could amount to child abuse. Has there been any consideration given to the impact of the Victorian requirement on the reporting of children held in immigration, the reporting of abuse of children held in immigration?
Look, I am slightly embarrassed to admit that doctors are mandated to report any form of child abuse, and this new change in terms of criminal proceedings is specific to child sexual abuse, so that's the first point. The issue as to conditions for children has been discussed. The Victorian legislative changes don't necessarily engender a response because the issue is specifically sexual abuse, but I think there are broader issues at play here in terms of the conditions for children and what that will look like over time, particularly if we don't have releases over the next months. would state that the conditions and health of the people I see at the moment is far worse than it was 6 months ago. And I actually don't know what that will look like if that keeps going for a further 6 months or longer.
Maryanne.
Can I comment on that? Because there are other mandatory reporters as well. Gillian finished by talking about the young girl looking for education prospects on CI. There is now on Christmas Island a learning centre. It's not called a school because of registration components, but it's being run by the Catholic Education Office from Western Australia. One of the things is that they're mandatory reporters. But I'm also very aware that the Department of Immigration, and Noel's been in on some of these discussions, also around various legislations around occupational health and safety, etc., have had to really think seriously about their own liabilities as individuals, not necessarily as the Commonwealth. And that started to become a discussion about 12 months ago. And I think also, I know, just I was wanting to respond a bit earlier, is that different refugee academic lawyers are also starting to talk about liability around the Minister himself and his portfolio, etc. So it's starting to get a lot more discussed. I think the human rights, the Royal Commission at the moment on child abuse, I'm quite sure that this issue will be before a Royal Commission at some stage in the future. So I think it's becoming a lot more evident. But as Gillian said, the reporting and getting the information and evidence is really problematic. And in the areas around the incidences of abuse, we often find that they have to be out of the held detention environment before we can actually even get professionals like Georgie to actually start to do assessments. It's very hard to get that sort of data. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of more lining up of people asking these questions than there was even 18 months ago.
Thank you, Maryanne. I was going to lead with the general question of the difficulty of applying the state legislation on Commonwealth land and under Commonwealth roles. Now, Noel is going to contribute to what we've just had, but you might also go on to that, Noel.
Well, I wanted to just comment on what we do within community. So the Australian Red Cross has very clear child protection policies. So we will report to state and territory child protection authorities any concern that we have, and we regularly report child protection concerns. So for people in community, which I'm interested in your comment about community detention, because I'm fairly certain we make reports about community detention as well, that the question is often whether the state authority is going to intervene, and our experience across the country is, you know, more involvement from some state and territory child protection authorities and less from others. But we have, as a routine, a practice of always reporting child protection concerns. The big question is what they do about it, whether they actually follow it up. Detention I can't talk because of the confidentiality about reporting in detention, so I won't go into detail about what we do there, but I do think that the jurisdictional issue is a challenge around detention and Commonwealth versus state and territory responsibility for what happens in detention. But certainly we would not sit on information ourselves, I could assure you, about what we would hear in detention without acting on it with the appropriate authorities.
Thank you.
And just the final point is also now with Nauru and Manus, we also have other legislation from other countries as well that's problematic to deal with.
All right, thank you. There's a question down the back. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for that contribution. Really interesting insights to the complex issues. In relation to the comment around what might be done, I wonder within Red Cross's way of working, this year is the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and optional Protocol 3 is available for signature now, which is a communications procedure and the ability of children to take their issues to the UN. So I think that might be a debate conversation we can have within Red Cross. The other issue is the really interesting fact you highlighted about the lack of data on the issues and developmental outcomes for children. We all know if we haven't got data, it's pretty hard to have the argument. And I wonder what thoughts you might have about how we can move to address that.
Can I start that? I'm sure Georgie's got a comment, but you would have seen with Gillian Trigg's inquiry that Dr. Peter Young from IHMS took the stand and actually talked about data that was being collected. But one of the issues that became apparent is that because of us having different populations, there isn't actually one standard tool that you can just give a series of questionnaires to all children and get X number of percent are depressed or X number. So IHMS are using a particular assessment tool or tools to look at children's mental health, but how that's to be interpreted and read is what brought about the discussion that Peter Young had with Gillian Trigg. And so there's kind of an academic debate going on, but there is some data. It's just how we interpret that data and what that data tells us. That's quantitative. It takes somebody like Georgie and others to do the qualitative that also needs to be wrapped around so that we've got a appropriate assessment of children with English as a second language, different cultural groups, etc. But there is some data. It's how it's accessibility to the data and what the data is really telling us is something that needs to be explored further.
I guess I would add that there are issues with test validity across any domain. It's not straightforward to do any form of diagnostic screening test or cognitive assessment or developmental assessment, and there are ethnic and cultural variations. We do to some extent rely on opinion and careful documentation, but I don't see any immediate solution to this. And the other issue is that we're one of the few services seeing this group. It is actually incredibly chaotic with interpreters and guards and kids and families. We are doing our absolute best to just get through the issues at hand and to understand the environment. Adding in a 2-hour research program on top of that is not actually feasible in the setting we're in the moment. I know that's not an adequate answer, and I would actually welcome suggestions as to how people think we should deal with this. I'm also aware of the trauma caused by submitting children to anything like that.
Thank you. Yes.
My name's Erskine Roden. I'm also on the IHL committee with David Harper, and under the good presidency of David Harper. I just wanted to ask issues about, all three of you seem to present wonderful constructive critiques about what's happening, and one of the worries I have is trying to persuade government to change. As you're probably aware, from the time of convict colony, we controlled our migration from the time of the wars, First and Second World Wars. We interned people. We've been dealing with people who have been allegedly outsiders in a very difficult way. So what I'm concerned about is how do you change the mentality of government so that you can persuade them the course that we're taking, or the courses that you want to take. And first of all, treatment, and secondly, looking after these people. What can be done? What steps should we actually take? And I'd like to hear from each member of the panel what they believe would be the most appropriate steps to take.
I'll start. One thing is, it's not enough to talk to the Minister of Immigration, because this is PM&C. This is Cabinet, because it's such a galvanising issue in Australian society. So that's something I've learned. People say to me, what does the Minister say? What can you say to the Minister? The Minister is only one voice at Cabinet. It's very much at that level that we've got the issues for both parties. So it's the issue of how this, and it's a bit like one of the damaging things which I should have said that happens to children is when they're in the community, they also see the news headlines. They also hear how we talk about these populations in our common sort of parlance and stuff, and we might dismiss it ourselves. They don't necessarily have that capacity to dismiss it and see it as a reflection on themselves. So I think the governments read us, and us is where the issue lies in terms of how we, the voting public, are. I think at the moment we've got the opportunity to work with these minorities senators, the independent senators, and we can get some concessions. They might be quirky, but they're concessions. So I think there's a space at the moment to work on, but there's a much bigger issue for us to work with the voting public to bring about change, because it's literally Cabinet that listen to what's going to keep us in power, both parties.
No.
George is thinking. Look, it's an excellent question. It's one that's exercising all of our minds at the moment. I agree with everything Maryanne has just said. I think there's a chicken and egg between public opinion and political opinion. I've heard politicians say very clearly that when they talk to their constituents about issues they're concerned about people jumping queues and asylum seekers. And the question I asked myself is, and this was in a regional New South Wales area, what part of regional New South Wales can open their back door and see boats coming in? So it really makes me wonder, you know, where do the politicians think people get the views from, because they don't interact with asylum seekers every day. And in fact, all of our experience tells us the communities we work with who do interact with asylum seekers have very different opinions. So I do think it's about changing community attitudes and driving political attitudes through that. You've got to do both. I am concerned that there could be a need for some generational change for this to happen. I personally have to maintain hope that this is a pendulum, that the pendulum will swing back, that what we've got at the moment is a fairly extreme policy position from both major parties at the moment. What we need is more of a management of a humanitarian issue approach. The one thing that I will just come back to, because Jennifer mentioned CROC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Jeff again around the Bill of Rights. I don't personally think that conventions and not meeting our international obligations cuts through at the moment. I think the thing that's going to cut through is bringing this home to people, the hearts and minds. And if you think back to Vivian Alvarez, and Cornelia Rao, thank you. Cornelia Rao was an Australian who was detained. Vivian Alvarez was an Australian who was removed. That's what cut through last time, was what the hell, this is happening to Australians, this could happen to me. It is too easy for people to depersonalise, dehumanise, and ignore what's happening because they're not people like us. You know, this is what's happening to people, bad people who come here, who jump queues, who do bad things. The more we can expose people to the realities of, you know, mums, dads, brothers, sisters, you know, the same sorts of hopes and aspirations, I think from Red Cross point of view, the more hope we've, you know, got of starting to try and get the message to cut through. The more we preach conventions, the more we preach, you know, that we're not doing what Geneva says. Quite frankly, I think there's something in the Australian psyche that says, great, you know, we're running our own race, we're, you know, bucking the trend, you know, up you Geneva, quite frankly. So I actually think that's the future for us. My fear is that it could be generational, that we might need to work on, you know, kids and young people, because it is so entrenched as a view now, but we've got to do it.
Just as well as isn't in the room, Noel. Georgie.
And I was a bit worried about being too frank. I won't paraphrase that, but will thoroughly agree with that. In terms of strategies to actually achieve that, I think linking children and families with schools is essential. So the school community get to know the people and the parents. And that actually takes active casework support, and I think that's where the welfare-based agencies can take a crucial role. It's not just about getting the kids to school, it's getting the parents into the school communities. So other people meet them, so they build engagement, so they learn additional language skills, and so they demystify. That was the first of my thought. I'm trying to track down the second one again. The second issue was humanising the stories for the department, and that it means linking the health stories and the migration stories in with the policy settings and the case managers. And I think there is a shifting of moral responsibility that arises with the fact that there is a gap between health services and department services, that caseworkers are implementing policy settings, that the people up the chain don't have the direct interaction. I think by building those links, we can, I guess, allow recognition of the people and their stories. The third thing is, I think the Australian public would be interested to know the cost. And I think the monetary argument flies under the radar, and I think in the time of current budget and constraints and cuts, that might be an interest. And Australians, whilst we don't have a great record of paying taxes, we have an interest in where they're going, and I think the cost argument is strong. And that's where I think there could be more public discourse.
If I can add my bit to this, Maryanne talked about the politicians and their reaction to the voting public. And the voting public hear about these other things through the media, not necessarily the newspapers anymore, because not so many people who are going to be influenced read those, but by the 30-second grab on the commercial television news programs. And we haven't been able to change those, but Red Cross has started a program in Western Australia, which we'll be putting out, of getting an alternative source of information into the home, and that's going into the schools and doing a myth-busting program. The banners that Noel talked about on our headquarters are there just to make a statement about refugees are the same as you and me, but seeking safety. And I don't know if any of you've been downtown. Red Cross isn't the only organisation doing this sort of thing, but St Paul's Cathedral has got a very great big banner right opposite the Flinders Street clocks saying much the same thing. So that's beginning to feed back. But if we think we can get to the children, even if, and we know today children, Australian children argue with their parents, if we can get the children to go home and say, Dad, you're wrong when you say that, doesn't matter if Dad puts them down, at least the arguments come into the families as an alternative source of information. That was a Western Australian.
Can I actually one more point, which is what I was grappling for. I think I don't support temporary protection visas on health grounds, but I have quite a lot of sympathy for regional and rural settlement models in terms of building bridges to local communities, and I think that will be a really interesting pathway to changing the attitudes of parts of Australia that maybe have not interacted with these people before, and I do have a great deal of sympathy for that as a proposed settlement model in many, many ways.
Yeah.
And John, just on that basis, can I just remember, of course, that most of our branch networks are in regional areas, and I actually think there's great opportunity within Red Cross for us to use our membership networks if we can start to influence our members and get our members to start to influence other people. These messages have to come from not the usual suspects.
That process has started. Our latest members newsletter that went out this week has just a small paragraph, but we're beginning that process. We've got to build on it though and drive it home. Is there any more questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm from the IHL office in Victoria, and I'm quite new to the Red Cross. It's a very exciting organisation to be a part of. But my question is, how does the Red Cross, and we've talked about humanising and all of this, but how does the Red Cross really get involved in an issue that is being so politicised? And you can't say refugee or asylum seeker without having, and even in the youth, without having political arguments being thrown around. You know, let's look after our own people first. They're jumping the queues. And for an organisation that is talks about neutrality, how do we deal with this fine line? And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, Noel, about, you know, what was the decision about putting up the banners? Because while I think they're fantastic, a lot of people would see that as a political statement.
Noel, if you want to answer.
Yeah, no, I love having this debate because it's one that we've had for a while. I'm very clear in my mindset, and I'm really happy to debate it with anyone, that neutrality is about not taking partisan political positions. As it is, both major political parties have the same position. So we're actually not taking a party political position on either side at the moment. The second thing I'd say is impartiality is about working with people regardless of you know, who they are, age, gender, etc. And I would add legal status into that, and that's part of our board's policy on migration. And the third thing I'd add is humanity. Is the banners are about saying that these are people. And the fact that the Australian debate has got to a point where just using the words asylum seekers and saying anything about them, and if you really scrutinise the words, we don't say they should be allowed to stay, we don't say they're being treated badly even. All we say is they're people like you and I seeking a safe future. The fact that that is seen as political, I just think is more of a reminder of why we have to get a purely humanitarian message out there and remind people it's a humanitarian message. you know, you might argue it's small p political. It's not to me, against the principle of neutrality.
I think it's very much you hit on it before, and I said it in the introduction, it's very much the principle of humanity. Margaret. And look, we'll wind up very shortly, just one or two more questions.
Hello, I'm Margaret Piper. I'm, amongst other things, a member of the Red Cross Board. I recently heard the term passionate neutrality, and I think that actually sums up beautifully what it is that the Red Cross should be about. It's not about staying out of the hard issues, it's about getting into the hard issues and standing up for the humanitarian principles. I also wanted to reflect on Noel's comment about, and Georgie's comment about regional settlement. I am thinking back to the days of the last round of temporary protection visas. The man who had the greatest impact on me, and I think on a lot of politicians at the time, was a man called Ian Skinner, who was a potato farmer from Tooleybuck in far northern Victoria. Ian knew nothing about international law, knew nothing about big P politics. He just knew that the Afghans who had come to work with him on his farm were good blokes, and he didn't want them treated badly. And he and his gumboots went to Parliament House in Canberra, and he told those politicians what for. And there were lots of Ians around the country, people, regional folks, who had encountered injustice. And as a passionate Red Cross person, I believe that as we move into this next phase, we collectively have a challenge to make champions of our Red Cross people, whether they're in regional centres and in the large urban centres, to prepare the way for the people who will be coming into our community, being released from detention, being granted protection on visas that exclude them from many of the things that refugees have normally seen. We are an agency that is well equipped to do that, and I would like to see that we will be leading the way, just as the people like Ian and the Rural Australians for Refugees movement did it the last time round.
Thank you, Margaret. I saw one more hand go up. Any question?
No, I was just really going to just make a comment, really, I guess, about all the things that we've heard today. And if you look at neutrality and humanity, it does seem it's pretty reasonable to build a really strong case for the children in detention. And I guess my question is, how far will we go? How far will Red Cross actually go to put its hand up, to march on the streets or do whatever we need to do with AMA, nursing, the other people, to actually get this not only into the public eye, but to actually create an outrage about this, because it is an outrageous issue. So I guess my question to you, Noel, is how far can we go?
Look, I'm one voice in a very big movement. My personal barometer for this is what impact we think it's going to have. So while I'll have the debate about neutrality, etc., I also have the debate internally about whether we should come out more strongly and criticise policy, which, you know, we can argue that humanity overrides neutrality at times. My argument at the moment is, if we're seen to just join every other voice at the moment, do we in fact potentially lose the potential impact we could have by taking a different path in the message we're getting out there? So my argument is to run, let's just humanise the issue. There are plenty of voices out there talking about the conventions, talking about what government policy is doing right and wrong. If we can use our part to start talking about putting some humanity into this and a human face on the issues, we just have to ask at each point, what impact is it going to have, positive and negative? So if coming out and being really bolshy was going to shift policymakers' decisions and you were going to see a change in the to the better for vulnerable people, I'd be right behind it arguing to do it. If it potentially weakens any impact we could have and means that our access would be potentially compromised, or next time we say something we're just seen to be party political and it hasn't had the outcome that we want, then I'd question whether it's the best thing for us to do. But I think it's a debate we have to have, is how far are we prepared to go?
One last question, and then we'll wind up. We're into that extra 10 minutes that Robert gave us, well and truly.
I'm Irene Tom, a volunteer with Red Cross, and I have to agree with Maryanne that the main business of government is to get re-elected, and the way to get re-elected is to win the swinging seats, and that's where Red Cross has to put its efforts, in the hearts and minds of the swinging seats, never mind the people who've already made up their mind a long time ago. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Georgie, Maryanne and Noel for both their presentations and the panel discussion. I think we haven't found an answer. This is an ongoing issue for us, but I hope you've all been galvanised to be part of it into the future. If we could put our hands together and thank the panel.